Hello, and welcome to this webinar on Beyond COVID-19, Keeping Your Charity Safe from Fraud, presented as part of International Charity Fraud Awareness Week 2020. My name is Alan Bryce, and I'm the head of counter fraud and cybercrime at the Charity Commission for England and Wales. I'm joined today by 5 charity leaders. David Clark, chairman of the counter fraud charity, the Fraud Advisory Panel. Rita Chadha, chief executive of the Small Charities Coalition. Phil Sapey, counter fraud manager at Cancer Research UK, one of the UK's largest charities. Karen Bradshaw, chief executive of the Charity Finance Group, and Cub Llewellyn Davis, the charity sector engagement lead with the National Cyber Security Centre. The purpose of this session is to highlight what fraud and cybercrime might look like in the next 6 to 12 months from a range of different charity perspectives: small charities, large charities, counter fraud professionals, and finance professionals, and outlines some of the big issues that charities should be thinking about now in order to prepare. After all, charities are no different to the public or private sectors in that they can and are being targeted by opportunistic fraudsters, organised crime groups, and cyber criminals. Those charities providing services and supporting local communities during this incredibly difficult time may be especially vulnerable. In fact, recent research by Pro Bono Economics in partnership with the Chartered Institute of Fundraising and the Charity Finance Group suggests that the coronavirus crisis will result in as many as 60,000 job losses across charities by the end of the year, large-scale cuts in service provision, and about a £10 billion drop in income, all at a time when many expect demand for their charity services to increase. This has important ramifications for managing the risk of fraud and cybercrime, with many charities having to make tough decisions on where to spend and where to save money. It also means that now, more than ever, charities need to be fraud aware and take steps to protect their money, people, beneficiaries, and assets from harm. This webinar complements an earlier webinar on COVID-19 and charity fraud that was issued in the middle of the UK lockdown called What to Watch Out For and How to Stay Safe, which is still available to listen to on demand from the Charity Fraud Awareness Hub. We'll begin with a short overview of fraud risks that have arisen during the pandemic and that we increasingly face as we move into a global recession. From David Clark, chairman of the counter fraud charity, the Fraud Advisory Panel. David, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak on this very important topic at this very crucial time. Thank you, Alan, for the introduction. I chair the Fraud Advisory Panel charity, which acts as a collective voice, if you like, of the counter fraud profession. And we're committed to tackling fraud, financial crime, supporting counter fraud professionals. And here's the thing, across sectors and industries. Today, I'll briefly explore with you whether the coronavirus pandemic has led to any new kinds of fraud or simply increased the opportunities for fraudsters to apply their existing, what we would say, tools of the trade to a new subject matter. Before touching upon the impact a recession might have on fraud, though, I think it's really good if we cast our minds back to late January and the start of the pandemic, in the UK at least. I don't think many of us fully appreciated just how profoundly life-changing it would be, or the impact would have on both our personal and professional lives as people went into lockdown. However, it was very clear early on in the pandemic that this would create the right environment for fraud to flourish, because fraud flourishes in crises. While many of us were struggling to get to grips with the lockdown and sort out our homes and turning homes and family lives around to accommodate our remote working, my charity also, my own company, fraudsters were similarly working out in lockdown ways to exploit the vulnerabilities, the anxieties, the fears that they take advantage of in this new normal that they were seeing, and they were very practiced. Our socially distanced life and living may seem safe in some respects, but there are new dangers that they would exploit. This is why my charity, the Fraud Advisory Panel, it's natural and right that we responded very quickly to this. And what we did in March, and starting on the 1st of April, we set up a COVID-19 Fraud Watch Task Force. And the intention of this was to share information and intelligence on the emerging fraud threats, and to act as a kind of early warning system to get out across sectors. And great to have Alan and the Charity Commission and so many great allies coming together. By and large, many of the threats that we saw during this period, and the COVID-19 Fraud Watch ran for 6 months, and what we were seeing by and large was the first wave of the pandemic were just variations of existing frauds, but with a COVID-19 disguise put to them. Though we are now seem to be in a decline as our lives have settled down a bit. Phishing emails are a good example of this. A typical HMR phishing email pre-pandemic would have simply said you were eligible for a tax refund. As government stimulus schemes were released, that refund was more likely to be linked to a new programme, or how about a grant setup deal with the coronavirus outbreak. So you can see they're twisting an old technique to something new to play on people's vulnerabilities, fears and needs. Now these are reverting back to more general tax refunds once more. One notable threat has steadily increased throughout the pandemic has been online shopping and auction frauds, probably most likely a result of changes to our shopping habits rather than the pandemic itself. Only a small proportion is linked directly to COVID-19 fraud. These frauds were initially related to the sale of fake medical goods. So we had, if you remember, all those discussions around the terrible challenges the country had in getting PPE and face masks. And of course, fraudsters always before everybody else were into that. They then moved on to things like, as that became under control, they moved on to, would you believe, pets, the sale of pedigree puppies and so on. Imagine now people are at home feeling very lonely. And of course, you know, my neighbours and good friends have all bought puppies, gets them out and so on. But that seemed another area for them to con people, and cars as well. And this focus will undoubtedly shift again as we move through the health crisis and now this second wave and lockdowns and so on. Investment frauds have also increased as we know. Many people and businesses, small businesses, extremely cash strapped, and they're being lured by get rich quick schemes and fake celebrity endorsements. I mean, this is terrible. People who you would trust giving this. And most recent, you will have seen yesterday with the report from UK Finance, our charity and a number of others, and the City of London Police. What we predicted was in lockdown, romance fraud would go up too, as people look for company. They want love. People feel lonely. Of course they do in isolation, of all ages and sexes. And in the last 5 months of an operation by the National Cyber Security Centre's Suspicious Email Reporting Service, received almost 3 million reports, many investment-related schemes. And as quickly as one dodgy site is successfully taken down, and they are taken down regularly, superb effort, another one pops up to replace it. Now, many charities provide support to people in financial and emotional distress, which can sometimes be seen as a direct result of frauds such as these. However, overall, many of the common risks to organisations, and I stress including charities, just as Alan said, charities and businesses, the same threats, appear to remain relatively unchanged. So far, that is. These include the phishing emails, smishing and vishing, computer viruses, payment diversion and mandate frauds, procurement fraud, so people trying to procure under new arrangements, perhaps like this over Zoom. I've been involved in interviews and selection and procurements, all done online recently. And of course, that CEO and business impersonation, right through to employee and insider fraud. What we had before, just exploiting this situation. There were data breaches resulting from the rapid shift to home working, the use of new online communication and collaboration tools, and really down to adequate and inadequate cyber defences. These have also been reported, and you will have seen some in the news. What I think is impressive there is, a lot of people have done extremely well to get those in, and here we are communicating like this. As we move into the recession, we will probably find that some of these risks will increase, especially those linked to employment. As I mentioned there, the money-making opportunities, the figures are terrifying and awfully, awfully sad for those people whose jobs are at risk now, and the end of furlough. It's so sad. And that temptation then to go and apply for a job which is a fake job, recruitment scams, advance fee, oh, pay me a bit and I'll get you this. Very, very sad. Now, while anecdotally we're told that while many organisations may not have seen an uptick in fraud since the start of the pandemic, it is, in all my experience, everyone I speak to in the counter fraud world, and my previous life was in law enforcement, is that it is likely that many frauds will slowly begin to be uncovered in the coming months. And this is as workers come off furlough or begin to return to their offices, as more job losses are announced, and as budgets continue to be squeezed, because borrowing, of course, has to be paid back. In fact, we're already beginning to see some of the warning signs in many businesses, and charities and individuals are being put under financial strain. Against this backdrop, it is certainly not the time for any of us in charities to be complacent. We really mustn't. Now, I know it's me saying this as a counter fraud charity. I'm also a director of a business, and sometimes security and compliance drops on the back. It's not the time to do that. And I'd finish really by saying, I'd like to quote the American investor and shrewd man, Mr. Warren Buffett, who once famously warned, it's only when the tide goes out that you learn who's been swimming naked. Let's be safe. Alan, back over to you.
Thank you, David. So, what does all this actually mean for the charity sector, and what are the emerging fraud and cybercrime threats that charities need to look out for in the next 6 to 12 months? I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn to share their thoughts with us. Firstly, Rita, according to the NCVO, there are over 136,000 registered small and micro charities in the UK, which makes up about 82% of all charities. And more than half of these have an income of £10,000 or less. Small charities already work extremely hard, as we're just hearing from David making exactly this point, working extremely hard to juggle back office functions with frontline delivery with such little resources. So how are these small charities likely to be affected over the coming year? Rita, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. I think it's really interesting when we talk about small charities, because small charities live in the business of hope. They exist to make a difference, and they live in perpetual hope of either getting more funding or being able to improve the lives of their beneficiaries. Here at the Small Charities Coalition, we're a national body that looks after 15,000 small charities, a lot of them without any funding at all and heavily dependent on volunteers. And I think what we've definitely started to see through our help desk is an increase in the number of people that may be working from home. That is to be expected. But actually, the way that people are working from home has changed considerably within small charities. Offices are being given up, and so volunteers are working from people's homes in a way that they're not fully set up for as well. And that does leave itself open to sharing passwords, seeing other issues that may be around and about in the environment. And also it lends itself to quite a few dangerous situations around safeguarding as well. I think for small charities in particular, there's a couple of areas that are particularly poignant and critical at the moment as well. And that's about cybersecurity. Small charities often think that they're not going to be victim to ransomware. They're, who would want to attack them? Anybody can be prone to a cyber attack or being hacked. And I think the sharing of passwords done with the best of intentions, but done in a state of crisis, can actually cause immense problems later on as well. We also have the issue of banking. For many small charities, it is still the case that they will struggle to get double verification on banking accounts as well. Opening a bank account is extremely difficult as well, but it is essential that actually small charities in particular pay particular attention, and trustees are aware of checks and balances around how banking is accessed and how bank transactions are made as well. And then the final point, actually, I'll return to again, is about that return to home working. It's about the long-term implications of that, and especially where we're starting to see volunteers that were before in an office space coming into a private space. What does that mean for the balance for personal security and organisational security as well? So just a few thoughts there, Alan.
Thank you, Rita. I think the points you make about home working certainly resonate very strongly with me, and I would imagine regardless of which sectors people work in, I think they really do reflect what's happening right across the country. Phil, if I can move to you now, from a large charities perspective, are the risks largely the same, or are they different? And as a counter-fraud professional, do you have any additional concerns?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. It's kind of an interesting question. So I think that of course the risks they get scaled up, don't they? I think that's one of the things, and I think one of the things that that we're in a position to do as a larger charity is actually revisit our fraud risk, so we can look at our fraud risk register and go, okay, we can look at how the landscape's changed, we can look at where the where people are getting squeezed, where the risks are, consider our fraud triangle, those sort of the basic tools of the fraud investigator. Did things like looked at David's the fraud advisory panels kind of COVID risks, and sort of looked at our charity and said, look, how are these going to kind of impact on our risks, and are the controls still the same with people working from home, with people furloughed? Are those controls still the same? So although I think the risks are very much the same but scaled up, perhaps we have a little bit more responsibility, to be honest, to revisit our risks and think about where those fraud areas might lie. And in terms of one of the things that I really considered in that process was looking outside the organisation. So we kind of got our the risk to the charities from from inside, but actually, of course, and again, as David pointed out really clearly, this pandemic affects everyone, so it's affecting our suppliers. So are our suppliers going to be more likely to kind of enter into a false invoicing scheme, or overcharge us, or overbilling, all those kind of things? So we're they're going through the same struggles as us, so the same risks that are kind of visiting themselves on us are going to be visiting themselves on our suppliers, and then of course on our beneficiaries, and our volunteers. So that whole arena is it's kind of exaggerated through the pandemic, and we've seen it in kind of as a counter-fraud professional, we've seen it in recessions and in kind of restructures in the past. So it's some really high level there. I could talk about it for ages, but I won't. I'll pass back to you, Alan.
Thanks, Phil. It's an interesting point you make about revisiting risks, and I think when we get further into this discussion, I think we'll be able to look at a few of those in much more detail. But that's certainly something I would encourage all charities to do at this time if they haven't done so already. Karen, if I can come to you now. What do you think then from a finance professional's perspective? What do you think we should be thinking about now in terms of frauds that may begin to emerge in that next 6 to 12 month period?
Thanks, Alan. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that we need to remember that finance professionals are often not just dealing with finances. They're often also the people that oversee the accommodation requirements, the HR, the IT, and therefore their remit is a very broad one across the organisation. And I think that just picking up on some of the comments that have been made already, one of the things that really needs to be focused in on for the next 12 months, 6 to 12 months, is this changing context. So back in March, we expected all of this to be a very sort of quick overnight crisis response. And I don't think any of us expected to still be sat here in October thinking about this continuing as a socially distanced, remote, digital working, virtual environment. And so the things that we were happy to accept in terms of compromises, if you like, almost corner cutting, that we were happy to accept in a crisis, now need to be reviewed as we sit in that gap between having responded to the initial crisis, but not quite knowing what the certainty of the future is going to look like. And by the sorts of things that I'm thinking about here are things like the willingness to use people's own equipment at home, for example. So if I think about my own organisation, not everyone had a laptop, and therefore we've gone through a process of using office equipment and getting that out to our staff, and with all the inherent risks that are related to sending out equipment, but also utilising people's own equipment at home. So we haven't necessarily paused and thought about the cybersecurity levels of security, firewalls, etc., that are there for our own staff, but also more practical things like shredding. You know, the documents that you're in a physical space, you would walk across to your physical shredder and pop in there, that would, you know, act as a level of control against fraud and abuse, may not be happening in a domestic environment. So these real practical things that I think we were perhaps happy to overlook almost in a crisis situation now need to be reviewed. And I think what I'd be suggesting to finance professionals is that they look at the systems that are in place. Are they safe? Are the staff using their own equipment? Are these systems now working effectively across the organisation? And the processes, the things that they had in place to prevent and to minimise opportunity in the workplace, in a physical workplace, now need to be thought about in terms of this ongoing mixture of home-based, some back in the office, and a blend of the two for many organisations. I would also think about the onboarding and exiting of staff. So during this pandemic, I know from CFG's own experience that we've onboarded 2 or 3 staff. What are the processes that we would have done in a physical environment, and are they different for a virtually onboarded individual? Do we have the same levels of training and insight and support that we would do in a physical environment? Are we now making sure that those translate into a virtual environment? So I think it's about the context having changed. We've heard about the risk going up, but the context has changed and it's become a bit more sticky. We know that we're going to be in this situation for some time to come. And then I think the closing thing I'd say before I hand back to you is really about the question of how you manage this going forward with your staff, whether or not this is something that we're going to have to pivot again in 6 to 12 months time, 12 to 18 months time, 18 months to 2 years time. As we are seeing, you mentioned 60,000 potential losses of jobs, we're going to see a pushing up of the opportunity and motivation to conduct fraud, whether it's within our own organisations or external to our own organisations, but also potentially the increase in opportunity, because if there are less bums on seats managing these risks, then there are holes that are likely to appear. So I think we have to be vigilant, alert, and we have to think about managing those risks and revisiting the decisions we've made. Back to you, Alan.
Thanks, Karen. It's an interesting point there, as given the topic of what we're discussing today, moving away from what has been 6-7 months of crisis management and the fraud risk related to what is now going to be the new norm, as it were, and then what will that be in another 18 months. So I think we've got a lot of reviewing, rethinking to do as the crisis develops. So finally, Cub, if I can come to you, you're our cybercrime expert. you've already heard a couple of speakers already refer to in different ways, different sort of cyber threats, whether it's from the finance perspective or even the small charities perspective. So what are the emerging threats that you expect to see coming down the line that charities should be preparing themselves for now?
Thanks, Alan. So I think probably the most important thing to get across first is that fundamentally the structures of cybercrime and the way we do cybersecurity aren't changing in a way that most people would notice. Yes, it's right to say that criminals will adapt to the environment we're now in, and David gave a really good example of that in his opening bit around before the pandemic. You might have got an email about a tax refund, and now you get an email about the furlough money that perhaps you're expecting, or some sort of grant from the government or a local authority body or something like that. And that's the way criminals will adapt to their environment. The techniques they're using, though, are fundamentally the same ones as they were pre-pandemic, even 5 years ago. And I think that's really important to remember, because I'm going to highlight two of those today that hopefully most people will have heard of, hopefully not have been victim to, but will be aware of. The first of which is phishing, and it's been brought up a couple of times already by speakers. It is the most common type of cybercrime we're all aware of. Everybody is used to getting an email that looks a little bit fishy, for want of a better pun. But it is the most common, and it's the most common both in our lives as consumers and as members of the public, but also in our lives as members of staff or volunteers or trustees in charities. I won't go into the depths of the sort of technical mitigations organisations can take, other than to say, please do have a look at the NCSC's phishing guidance. It's a fantastically easy to follow piece of advice that looks at the different layers that you can take as an organisation. But in short, it effectively relies on the fact that you need to assume that some emails will reach your staff and your volunteers. As many technical controls as we can put in place, and as good as those can be, they won't always catch every single phishing email. Otherwise, there would be no need for us to even be talking about it. So to help with that, you can help your staff and your volunteers to spot those common signs of phishing emails. But importantly, don't blame them if they do click on a link. You know, I've heard some horror stories of people, you know, they click on a link or they enter the details, and the next thing they know, they're in front of their chief exec being yelled at for putting the organisation at risk. It was just someone trying to do their job. And ultimately, if somebody does click on a link, you need to respond quite quickly to that. David very kindly mentioned the success of our suspicious email reporting service, which came out at the beginning of the pandemic. It's been something we've been working on for a very long time, but it was a very opportune moment to launch that. So phishing, absolutely, Alan, is probably the one that everybody will see over the next 6 to 12 months, but that's probably not different to the previous 6 to 12 months or even a number of years. And the second one I want to highlight is ransomware. So there's been a number of reports in the media recently of quite significant ransomware incidents. We'll touch on one later, I think, but they can be devastating. It's effectively you come in one day to find that your IT systems have a big notice on the screen that says, we have locked all of your devices, and unless you pay us, a number of bitcoins normally or some sort of other cryptocurrency, we're going to keep that locked. That's really frustrating, because obviously you now can't access anything. You'll also spend much of the first half of the day trying to work out how on earth you would buy bitcoins if you were going to choose to pay the ransom. We'd obviously encourage people not paying the ransom. It puts money in the hands of criminals. We've recently revamped our guidance around ransomware as well to respond to the kind of new ways that ransomware is working. But again, fundamentally, ransomware hasn't changed in the last few years. But if there's two things I can leave you with on this point to protect against ransomware, it's back up your information. If you have good, solid backups, falling victim to ransomware is an inconvenience rather than a potentially devastating blow on a charity that, you know, at this moment in time has a lack of resource, has a lack of time, and probably in the current financial situation is short on money. If you have a backup, you might lose a day reinstalling everything, but actually you can recover really quickly. And just please, as a completely preventative measure, make sure all your systems are patched and updated. They're free, they're easy to do, and they are one of the most effective ways you can protect your charity from ransomware and other types of malicious cybercrime. But that's probably where I'll leave it, Alan. Back to you.
Thanks, Cobb. I am struck by how, in effect, doing the basics, as it were, especially around ransomware, as you highlight there, if charities do apply the basics, they really do minimize their risks to such a significant extent. And I can certainly confirm from the Charity Commission perspective that the two, by some way, the two most common types of cyber attack that is reported to us as the regulator is phishing and extortion by some distance. So I think we're definitely looking in the area where perhaps this year has changed slightly in terms of ramping up, but it continues to be a real significant problem. So thanks to everyone for, I think we'd all agree, some really thought-provoking insights into what might be heading our way over that next 6 to 12 month period. I'd now like to drill down into some of the more emerging risks highlighted by our speakers. Cobb, since I have you on the line, as it were, I'd like to come to you first on the topic of cybercrime. So we've heard several people, others, speaking about cybercrime. It clearly is a theme that resonates. It is a growing risk and has been for so long. So Cobb, do you think there are particular types of charities then that might be especially susceptible to certain types of these cyber threats?
Thank you, Alan. In short, no. Unfortunately, everyone is susceptible to cybercrime. I think Rita really hit on the point quite early on in her opening line that actually a lot of small charities start off with a view that is very similar to one that I heard almost on my first day out on the road talking to charities when I took on this job, where a very small local charity outside London came and said, you know, we're trying to support people with cancer. What on earth could they want to target us for? And unfortunately, while it's true that they're probably not being specifically targeted, there is an enormous amount of completely untargeted mass phishing campaigns and sort of out of anyone's control viruses and malicious software out there. They're not going after the small local hospice or cancer charity or horse sanctuary, but unfortunately those victims are just as likely as anyone else to fall victim to it. It is true, however, that larger, more well-known charities are probably likely to be targeted specifically with perhaps more complex, more advanced types of cyber attacks. They might be going specifically after the chief exec of that larger charity because they have quite a public profile, perhaps. They might do a little bit more research to try and identify the finance professionals, for example, within that organisation. But I think, in short, really every charity is susceptible to cybercrime. I think the ones that are more susceptible than others are the ones that aren't prepared, unfortunately. That preparation is the key to making yourself less susceptible to falling victim. You might not be less likely to be targeted, but you are less likely to fall victim. And I think the fundamental part that I try and get across there is that it is everybody's responsibility within the organisation, right through from the person answering inquiries on the front desk through to the IT team, of course, but also the senior management team and the board. And I think from my perspective of all of those, it's ultimately the board's responsibility, cybercrime. We talk, a lot about risk and who ultimately owns risks within an organisation, and it's that board of trustees within charities. And therefore, with cybersecurity and cyber attacks being a risk that needs to be managed, the board have an ultimate responsibility for that. And I think the key thing that I would encourage all boards to do, without needing to delve into the deeply technical bits of it at all, is set a culture within that organisation that everybody has a responsibility for cybersecurity. That is the best way, in my view, you're going to, as an organisation, become less susceptible to cybercrime. I think, as a bit of an analogy, we've seen this very successfully in the way that over the last sort of decade or so, health and safety has become something that is so entrenched in everything anyone does. Even, if you fall over in the office and graze your knee, you can guarantee there's someone ready with that HS1 form ready to fill in and mark it down so that incident's been recorded. And that is the level of entrenchment that it's got to within an organisation, and where I'd like to see cybersecurity being. I think there's one last bit that I think it'd be remiss not to point out at this point, and while we can talk about the defences that every charity can take and the responsibility everyone has, there is also a sort of an elephant in the room in this as well, which is suppliers. And you can take as many steps as you can with your own security, but unfortunately, there is always a risk that someone in your supply chain will suffer a cyber attack that has a knock-on effect on your charity. We've seen this very publicly in the news over the last couple of months with Blackboard. There was a press release that went out updating on the situation just, I think, last week, where over 100 UK charities have now reported to the Charity Commission, to Alan's team, to say that their data was caught up in the Blackboard breach of fundraising data and various other types. So as much as you can control your own environment, there is also a need increasingly to look at what data your suppliers are holding for you, how they're holding that, and what controls you feel as the procuring organisation you want them to put in control. So I think that is one that everybody needs to be aware of, but I think it's one that will probably come to the fore over the next couple of years as well.
Thanks, Gob. And yes, you're quite right. Unfortunately, over 100 charities have now reported to us at the Commission in relation to that particular case that you're talking about. But then it does strike me, because it's not something we have talked about much, is actually the role of other individuals, other organisations, as you say, suppliers. So we all really do have a part to play in making all charities safe. So I'll just ask now come to the rest of the panel then to get their views on what the key challenges facing the sector and individual charities will be in tackling fraud and cybercrime over the coming months. Phil, perhaps if I could come to you first. We know that insider fraud is one of the largest risks to charities. You referred to it yourself, as did other panel members. Could I ask what some of the challenges in your experience are for charities trying to prevent insider fraud, and how the current environment might make this a bit more difficult?
Yeah, sure. I think, I mean, something that that Karen mentioned about vetting and due diligence, and just kind of the whole onboarding process can be a little bit more tricky, kind of just at the moment. Of course, everything's just so yeah, it's just learning the new ways of doing things. I think the other thing to remember is, I mean, I found that during this time, and loads of people have said it in conversation, but I mean, just the kind of is the feast or famine thing with the work. So of course, you know, we know that it's a terrible time in terms of kind of there's going to be job losses, there's going to be restructuring, and I'll come on to that a little bit in a minute. But the thing that has also happened is that others have just been so busy. I mean, I've been absolutely working. I mean, it's just been so much to do, so much to get done. And of course, it's at those times when things can slip through the nets a bit more easily. So I think there's something, something to be said to just kind of watch out for that busyness and make sure that your controls are still operating exactly as they should, especially when you're trying to rush the process of getting somebody on board. So yeah, make sure your barrel's full of good apples. That's my something I think is really important. But then the other thing, and again we sort of touched on it a bit, is the risks around restructure. So we've talked about actually it's kind of again, Karen mentioned again kind of the fraud triangle, mentioned about opportunity and of course there is that risk when we restructure that kind of key roles in the control functions get restructured out of the organisation. Nobody has realised, and then all of a sudden a fraud happens. How did that happen? And you go, well, the person who signed that off doesn't, that post doesn't exist anymore, or whatever. But of course, the other thing with restructure, and it's really important for charities to remember this, is is around the rationalisation. So when people are at risk of losing their jobs, of course, they might do something they wouldn't ordinarily have done. They've joined the organisation as an honest individual, and then all of a sudden, everything's changed, and then there's sort of a justification in their mind for committing fraud. And just finally on that, on that kind of on that thought, it's a little bit around again. So I mean, I've kind of worked around counter fraud for but yeah, years and years and years, and the you know, one of the things I found kind of working a lot more in the charity, meeting sort of so many great people, is that they're so motivated for the cause of the charity, and actually I think that there's a you know, almost a risk again. It's that kind of that analogy of, you know, with when, you know, when tide goes out, you find out who's been swimming without their swimmers on, you know. But I think the you know, I think the you know, the what happens is that people are kind of doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. It's not necessarily a fraud that's even going to benefit themselves. Sometimes it's a fraud or a you know, compliance breach that leads to a fraud in that murky area where somebody doesn't do the right thing, but they're not doing it to benefit themselves. They're doing it because they think it's a benefit to the charity, and it can easily fall into the area of criminality, you know, or at least you know, financial irregularity, and put us in difficult situations. So yeah, so I mean, I'd say yeah, so yeah, the vetting and due diligence, and the you know, the risks around restructure, and just you know, thinking about motivation, rationalisation for yeah, for people within the organisation. So, yeah, that's plenty. I'll pass back to you, Alan.
Thanks, Phil. Actually, that's a really interesting point that we never really discussed that much. Is as a counter fraud professional, we know the tradition of motivation being about greed or even need for the individual, and that's why that's what usually drives them. But in a charity context, there is that risk, unfortunately, that some people will be motivated for the good of the cause as opposed to their own individual benefit. And sadly, in my career, I have seen that on occasion. It will be interesting to see how things, as I say, comes out in the wash next year, as perhaps some of these cases start to come to fruition. And certainly from our perspective at the Charity Commission, just so you're aware on this point of the insider fraud aspect, I mean, our research last year, and it is, as far as we're aware, I mean, it was a representative sample of all charities in the UK, and perhaps we think one of the largest pieces of research of this kind, jointly with the Fraud Advisory Panel last year. And something like half of all frauds are committed by people known to the charity. So really, that risk and that dynamic is sadly still there, and something that will come out, I'd imagine, even more in the next period. Karen, then, can I come over to you now? So, what are some of the challenges that charities will face in protecting their finances then?
Well, I'm glad I go after Phil there, because I think actually what I'm going to say probably carries on very nicely from what Phil has said, which is I think particularly that last point about motivation. I can imagine there's no evidence of it, and certainly, you know, that this is happening against charities particularly, but we have heard, for example, about the abuse of the bounce back loan scheme. I can imagine that for some organisations there may be a heightened incentive for finance professionals to massage the figures, to, you know, say someone wasn't working when they actually were, and, you know, all those sorts of motivations that are not driven by personal greed, but actually desperation in a situation where the sector is really on its knees, I think actually is something that we need to be alert to across the organisation. So it isn't just about the finance professionals being clear on their own internal controls. It's about the infrastructure of the organisation ensuring that the finance professionals don't necessarily allow their best intent to drive them down a route that is not healthy or legal. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point I would make is that I think as the sector becomes more vocal and you hear much more around the Never More Needed campaign, there will be potential for charities to have their money diverted away from the charity by people who are springing up to raise funds for the charities that they hear are suffering great plight. So, you know, your favourite causes may well end up with spontaneous fundraising that isn't being done on behalf of the charity. Actually, it's diverting funds away from it. So I think we have to be really aware of how that element plays in to our own awareness and activities. And then I guess the last thing I would say is going back to the points that I made right at the beginning around the controls. We need to recognise that the controls that we have now are fit for purpose for what we're doing right now. And they may not be the same things that were fit for purpose in the office, and they may not be the same things that are fit for purpose once we end up with whatever the certainty is after we've come through this immediate crisis period. So I think we do have to take steps to ensure that there is no false accounting, that the loss of time and resources doesn't mean that we end up pulling ourselves too thinly and cutting corners that leave us exposed and lead us into actually exacerbating the problems around fraud. Back to you, Alan.
Thanks, Sharon. It's an interesting last point around the internal control environment in particular. Our research last year with Fraud Advisory Panel found that 2/3 of all frauds identified by charities was either through internal controls or by the audit function. So applying the basics will address so many of the problems that we could be facing from a fraud perspective. Sorry, Karen, you want to say something else?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up that last point, and we haven't mentioned the fact that all external as well as internal audits are not being able to be undertaken in the same way that they would have been, in a physical environment. So that question of having people actually coming physically on to do a stock take or to examine those aspects of our businesses aren't happening in the same way that they were previously. So we do need to recognise that the context of internal and external audit has been changed.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that, of course, is something that probably is going to be the case for some time going forward as well. So a growing potential issue for us to deal with. So finally, Rita, if I can come to you, are there any specific challenges then facing the small and the micro charities?
Thank you, Alan. Actually, let me follow on a little bit from what Karen's just said as well. And I think it's the absence of control. Smaller charities don't think assertively about being anti-fraud. So they will, I know very few very small charities that actually have a space or a discussion point about this on their trustee board meetings or have policies to try and look at this in more detail. So I think one of the challenges has got to be for small charities to actually move to an assertive position where they are countering fraud and they're preempting any challenges that could arise their way. And I think that's difficult when you haven't got a large team, where you may not have any staff, where trustees may be operational and strategic at the same time as well. So I think carving out that space, both in terms of resources and in time for small charities is really, really important. It's critical because we all know that the impacts of being victim of fraud, in whether it's cyber or whether it's financial or whether it's about in another form, is hugely expensive to a charity. The costs and the reputational ramifications can be immense. So I think smaller charities need to think about this as a long-term investment. As we all know, and as many of the speakers have said, the environment is going to continually change over the next 18 months, and we can't be certain what the futures are like, but we can take some educated guesses about what the likely threats are potential, and use that as a basis to develop and build our organisations from. So I think, one of the things that would be really nice would be to see small charities having an anti-fraud champion on their trustee board, even if it's a touch base once a quarter, somebody that actually has that headspace to think about it and keep abreast of all the information, all of the advice out there. And a lot of the challenges are about actually just making sure that you're up to date with the latest information as well. And I think it is important to remember there's lots of good work happening in this space as well. There are opportunities to engage in the discussion with many of the people on this panel as well. So I think, we've got to make sure small charities actually focus on this as a long-term objective as well.
Thanks, Rita. That's something I wholeheartedly endorse. In particular, I like that idea of an anti-fraud champion for small charities. This can be an issue that often people don't want to delve too deeply into, and having that sort of lead on among your trustees, I can only see benefits from it. So it's certainly something I'd very much encourage. So finally, in concluding today's session, could I ask each of the panelists in turn if they could perhaps share one fraud prevention tip to keep a charity safe? What would that be? David, perhaps if I could start with you.
Yep, thanks. Thank you, Alan. And terrific advice there. There's so many points there. I suppose going from my side, I am an ex-cop, so fraud's always on my agenda, even with my own firm. And like Alan said at the beginning, these issues affect small businesses and large businesses too. For not wanting to be gloomy, try and bring it back up, I suppose, and not be negative. My top tip is around these core messages, and it's the core message of this year's Charity Fraud Awareness Week. Simply to be fraud aware. Now, of course, I'm going to say that being an ex-copper and a trustee as well, volunteer for 9 years, coming up 10 years. But it means getting out to everybody. Absolutely. The message, I think we've said, Alan, haven't we, at previous events, that tone from the top, whether you're large or small organisation, what we say and do really means something. I love those points you said earlier, everybody being just savvy and aware of, could this be fraud? What could I do? And that it can be everywhere. And I certainly had that. I remember when I was a young guy in the Air Force, who was responsible for making sure that a bolt wasn't left on the engine of the Tornado jet before it went off. It wasn't the engineer's job. It was everybody's job in the Royal Air Force to make sure that that operation happened without danger to someone. So health and safety means be fraud aware and lead from the top to show people that we're doing that. And really, it is very important because, to all the listeners and viewers, just take a moment and feel it now, the rumbling. It's rumbling and it's very dangerous. So we know something's coming. Let's prepare and keep together and be aware. Thank you, Alan. Back to you.
Thanks, David. Karen, what would your top tip be then?
Well, I think my team would probably not forgive me if I didn't plug the fraud awareness pledge that we came up with a few years back. So I think getting the basics right is absolutely necessary. David is quite right, but often, as Rita has said, there are so many small charities and other charities that don't know where to start with it. So I would say the fraud pledge is a good way to start. It gives you some pinpoints, some starter points, and gives you some top tips, and enables you to have something that is outwardly saying we're taking this seriously. Back to you, Alan. Thanks,
Karen. I'd certainly wholeheartedly endorse that tone from the top message that you're referring to there, and making that sort of public commitment that many charities did. And I'd also say to those other charities, we also advocated something called Tackling Charity Fraud, the 8 Guiding Principles that we published as part of Charity Fraud Awareness Week 2019. And again, same sort of idea. If the charities want to show the tone from the top, we encourage the board to adopt those. They really do help. So then, can I move over to Rita then? What would your top tip be?
I think in keeping with the theme, and as for small charities, make sure that it's on your agenda. Put it on the trustee board meeting. Don't wait until next year and think you'll look at it later. Do it after this webinar. Make sure your next board meeting has a section on it, and use that as an opportunity to raise awareness and change the culture of the organisation.
Thanks, Rita. Yes, definitely. Don't delay. I think that's absolutely vital. If you want to prevent, you need to take action now. Phil, your top tip.
So one tip, and as awareness and pledges have been mentioned, I think the key thing is that staff know where to report their concerns. So have in place a whistleblowing hotline, or a concerns hotline, a speak up, a way to speak up, and make sure that the people that are going to get or going to hear those concerns know what to do with them. I think that's one of the things that I do see sometimes is an organisation has ticked the box and gone, no, we've got a reporting hotline. This is the number, but the thing is, the person who receives that call that doesn't really know what to do with it, and we wouldn't dream of that with safeguarding. We'd make sure that that there's somebody in place who can deal with that, and we need to do the same with counter fraud financial irregularities.
Thanks, Phil. In fact, our research shows that whistleblowing, raising a care, is usually the second or third most common way for any charity to identify a fraud, because people in the organisation know where the weaknesses are. So yeah, very much so. It's an important part of the armour for any charity, is good whistleblowing arrangements. And finally, Cub, if I can come to you, what would your top tip be?
Thanks, Alan. I'm afraid going to sound like a very broken record. I think my top tip has probably been running through all of the previous things I've said, but it's essentially do the basics. And those for me and in cybersecurity are do your updates, back up your data, and the one that I haven't mentioned yet, but everybody knows about is making sure you've got strong and separate passwords across your important accounts. I think if you don't want to take my word for it, Michael McIntyre sums it up absolutely brilliantly on his new Netflix special, where if he manages to effectively guess your password on his comedy show, you probably ought to change it. Just putting a capital letter at the beginning, a number at the end, which is invariably 1, and then an exclamation mark after that really isn't sufficient for creating a strong password anymore. So NCSC's advice now is take 3 completely random words, put them together, and it creates a far better password. But I definitely encourage anyone interested in how to get over their bad passwords to have a look at Michael McIntyre's sketch.
Thanks, Cobb. And on the personal note, I have to say that I completely changed all my passwords about a year ago, after the first time we had a discussion about this issue, for exactly that reason. So if you'd like any more information then on spotting and stopping charity fraud and cybercrime, I would just say, please take a look through our Charity Fraud Awareness Hub for a variety of the free resources, including short tutorials, on-demand webinars, videos, and help sheets. And remember, now more than ever, charities need to be fraud aware and take steps to keep themselves safe from harm. Well, unfortunately, that's just about concludes this webinar. All that's left for me to do now is to thank our guests, David, Karen, Rita, Phil, and Cub, and you, our audience, for joining us today. And don't forget, by working together, we can keep charity fraud out. Thank you for listening, and keep safe.